Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about One State, Two States by Benny Morris. This book was written in 2009. For those of you who don't know, Benny Morris was one of the so-called new historians who used Israeli state archives to write, I would say, real histories of Israel as opposed to propaganda. And his books, many of his books about 1948 and the time around 1948 and the Palestinian refugee problem are considered standard textbooks and are accepted by people on both sides of the argument as fairly even-handed. Morris himself personally also refused to serve in the occupied territories. He refused to serve in the IDF, and he actually went to jail for this. Now, you have to take that right next to the fact that Morris has also said that the actions of the organizations that expelled the Palestinians in 1948, which he showed through proof in his books, were necessary to create the Jewish state, and that in fact David Ben-Gurion did not go far enough in his ethnic cleansing. So when you hear all of these things about Benny Morris, you think, what am I to think of this person? This is someone who tries to do good history, but then justifies the bad parts of it. Not really sure what to do. He also has this annoying tick of calling everybody who disagrees with him a liar, which is not a real professional way to do history. However, that said, if you look in the comment section of one of the very first videos I did about this, in fact, the first video I did on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, you'll see Benny Morris, Benny Morris, Benny Morris, Benny Morris, that Benny Morris is the only person who can be trusted and everyone else can't be. That's not true. I do think Benny Morris at least reveals his biases when he writes, but he is hardly to be considered the only objective historian or having no biases. I just don't think that's true. So he wrote this in 2009, which was 3 years after the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza by the Israeli state. And I think the plan of the book is generally a good one, in which he is trying to walk people through the history from the mandate to the present day. The ideas that grew didn't really go anywhere where they are now. For example, the one state idea. And then the two-state idea as it developed. And then today, some calls again for a one-state idea. And then he puts forth what I would call a science fiction proposal at the end of this. And we'll get there. But I just wanted to give you an idea. It's not a long book. It's a couple hundred pages. It is a history book, but it's a history book focused with a policy at the end, which I think is useful. I think this is a useful addition to the discussion. And as I've always said, learning about Israel and Palestine, it's one of the few things in my life in which learning more has not made things clearer to me. It has only made things more complicated. And I think he manages to make things more complicated here than they need to be. So let's get into the text, shall we? So here are just some facts. Haifa University geographer Arnon Sofer has argued that by 2020, the total population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean will reach 15.5 million, with only 6.4 million of them being Jews, and most of the rest, 8.8 million, being Arab, creating a binational reality, albeit with a substantial Arab majority. The Palestinian Arab birth rate is the highest in the world. Think about that for a moment. With all of the things that the Palestinians are going through, it's the highest in the world. You want to talk about a people with hope against adversity. The natural increase among Palestinian Muslims is estimated at 3% per annum. Among Israel's Arab minority and the West Bank Palestinian population, it stands at 3.1%. Among southern Israel's Bedouin population, it is at 4.5 to 5%. And among the Gaza Strip Arabs, it stands at 3.5 to 4% per annum. By comparison, in 2006, Egypt's annual population increase was about 2%, in Turkey 1.3%, and in Iran 1.2%. Israel's overall natural increase in 2007 stood at 1.5%. I just highlighted this because I just think this was so hilarious. He says, the United States is completely powerless to effect change in the rejectionist position of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Palestinian majority that supports them. And it is, listen to this, it is only marginally influential with regard to Israeli policies on the basic issues. Benny Morris expects us to believe that if the United States didn't say jump, that Israel wouldn't say how high if they really meant it. I'm not saying that there's a US government that ever would have the will to do that. But the idea that the US government is only marginally influential with regard to Israel's policy, the war that's being fought in Gaza at this time, and we're talking about early 2024, is a US war against Gaza. It is not an Israeli, strictly speaking, war. The US permits it to happen. They put aircraft carriers into the region immediately, basically to threaten anybody else who would come to the aid of the Gazans. This is a US proxy war. For anyone who wants to deny it, just look at the facts. Here's another very strange quote of his. The proportion of Christians among Palestine's Arabs has been declining steadily since 1947, when they were close to 10% of the population. Today, less than 5% of Palestinian Arabs are Christians. Okay, that's fine. There was a historic, significant minority at 10%, and today it's less than 5%. He says the Christian element in Israel-Palestine is negligible and politically irrelevant, which, by making it only an Arab-Jew thing and there's nobody else who lives there, you create this situation, not quite zero-sum, but it's this side or it's that side, and say there are other stakeholders other than Jews or Muslims. The idea, this also heightens the idea that Jews and Muslims have sole title to this land, that no other people in the world are interested in this land. And that is a crazy idea. It's a crazy idea. So here we get into some assertions about how the land has been viewed by different forces. Put simply, the Palestinian Arab nationalist movement from inception and ever since has consistently regarded Palestine as innately, completely, inalienably, and legitimately Arab and Muslim, and has aspired to establish it in a sovereign state under its rule, covering all of the country's territory. And I would argue it doesn't even need to necessarily be quote unquote Palestinian Arab nationalist movement. I remember having a conversation with some Palestinians in Amman about calling it Israel. They would refuse to even call that this state of Israel. They said it's all Palestine. And I was trying to make the point that, okay, there is this state there, and you can't just get rid of all of them and say that Palestine is going to be the state. And they looked at me like I was an alien. Well, of course they could. Of course we could call it Palestine, and of course they could be made to leave. And they were looking at international law and saying, okay, who was here before 1947, or even who was here before 1914, and those people will be allowed to stay, and everyone else will have to leave. And not realizing that may be a solution that they like, but that's not a solution that's going to be internationally supported. So you have to be realistic in your aims. And this is true that there have been many Palestinian Arab nationalist movements that see all of the land from the river to the sea as the only place for a unitary Palestinian state. So we have to acknowledge that this is true. This is a quote from a Jewish leader who was seeking, you could say, a Palestinian partner to help him move towards a one-state solution. He never found anyone to help him. But a quote says, "The Balfour Declaration contains the seed of resentment and future conflict. The Jewish people cannot suffer injustice to be done to others, even as a compensation for injustice over the centuries done to them." He wrote that in 1920. So there have been prominent Jews who have wanted some kind of peace prior to 1948, but they were not listened to either by other Jews or even by Palestinians. As we get closer to the time of the mandate, he says, "A Jewish state with an Arab majority was generally regarded as inconceivable, and a Jewish state with even a very large Arab minority, say a 55 to 45% ratio, was seen as highly problematic, not to say unviable." And once again, this sort of math, creating countries by math, it assumes nothing is going to change. It assumes that people don't want to move or people don't want to immigrate, and this is not dealing in reality. Other people, keep in mind, even when the partition plan from the United Nations came and there were Israelis that were dancing in the streets, they were the militant right, are like the Ze'ev Jabotinsky, that arm of people who wanted all of it. And you have to keep in mind, when you think all of it, they're talking about what was then known as Transjordan, which today is the country of Jordan. They wanted all of that as well. Here in 1946, Menachem Begin, head of the IZL, the revisionist military arm, the revisionist part of that group that Ze'ev Jabotinsky was a leader of, denounced the prospective partition as a crime, a caricature, treason. The dissection of our homeland is illegal. And there was still, some attempts. Ben Gurion finally pushed down on this, but there was a minority, local minority, that wanted all of that land. So it wasn't just from the river to the sea; it's on the other side of the river. We want that too. He admits here, which I think is interesting and insightful, the Six-Day War triggered powerful expansionist and messianic urges in the Israeli public, especially on the right and among religious nationalists. And he goes on to point out that as the conflict has drug on, you've seen a move to more religiosity on both sides. So, and that's part of why Hamas was elected in Gaza, is there has not been a move to greater secularism. So if we look at the Israeli political climate and the Palestinian political climate, there hasn't been a development of, let's create some centrist parties that will try to do a deal. Both sides have only gotten, understandably, for whatever reason, more militant. And so you have a right wing in Israel that is more right wing than ever. You have a youth in Israel, which I witnessed on my own eyes. I saw it in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day. And the sort of fervor in the streets, the young people are more conservative than their elders. It's a very unusual situation in the world. And what we didn't see before, let's say in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in which there were still some possibilities of a political movement that wasn't defined by religion, this is becoming less and less the case now. And he makes that point. Hence, Palestinian spokesmen, and this is, let's say, later on. When I say later on, I'm saying it has been talked about these days, but at the time, early on in the mandatory rule, there were Palestinian spokesmen who were bringing up the ideas of democracy, majority will, one man, one vote, catchphrases and norms that, in fact, were completely alien to their history and social and political ethos and mindset. This is true. And that's something that you have to realize. You can't just say we want a secular democratic government when that isn't something that is normative in your culture, and that you want everyone in your culture to observe that. That is a big, big ask. Here he's quoting George Antonius, who, like Magnus, is looking at the situation, although Antonius was an Arab Christian. Jewish distress in Europe should not be solved at the expense of Palestinian Arabs, an argument that has been a refrain of Palestinian Arab nationalists ever since, and it's a good one. Here he talks about Camp David, and this is a real stretch. Listen to what he says here. At base, Barak put on the table an offer of a Palestinian state in exchange for peace. Israel made a series of proposals, each better than the last on territory. Now, that may be true, and if you read some of the peace negotiations, it seems that was happening, that there kept being escalations, and it may be that Arafat over-haggled, okay? However, he does point out here something which has been noted by many people. Barak, for his part, offered nothing in writing and presented no maps, later arguing that he had not wanted to leave the Palestinians with a series of concrete Israeli concessions in hand, which would then have served as the starting point in a future round of negotiations, if the Palestinians offered no concessions of their own and Camp David collapsed. However, that sentence there, that assertion, contradicts what he was talking about earlier when she said the Israelis came, they were making their best faith offer, Arafat refused this. But if this was the best faith offer, then why not leave it there as a starting point for future discussion. Say, all right, we will give you at least this, as opposed to making it some ticking time bomb that if you don't accept this right now, we're never going to have a peace agreement. And the question is, were the Jews negotiating in good faith at that time? Were the Israelis negotiating to really try to come to an agreement? Or were they just going through the song and dance because Clinton was putting pressure on? And here he talks about Hamas. And remember, Hamas's name in Arabic is really effectively the movement. The movement is characterized by its deep understanding, accurate comprehension, and complete embrace of all Islamic concepts of all aspects of life, culture, creed, politics, economics, education, society, justice, and judgment, the spreading of Islam, education, art, information, science of the occult, and conversion to Islam. That is the reality of Hamas. There's no reason to apologize for that, but what he's pointing out is this radicalization of the Palestinians who've looked at the Palestinian Authorities effectively ineffective work for the Palestinians over many, many years, much corruption, which Palestinians have told me about. And they said, well, Hamas has a different message. We'll go with that. And if it's a bit more religious, that's fine with us as well. And the people in Gaza were radicalized by the treatment that they were given by the Israelis and frankly, by the rest of the world. It's not that surprising. So the science fiction, what I call science fiction solution that Morris leaves us with is a creation. He wants the West Bank. And when I say he wants, this is just a proposal he's making. He's not sitting here dreaming of it. But as he's dismissed other possibilities, including federal possibilities, which I would note when I visited Cyprus, I saw a flag in a coffee shop for United Federal Cyprus. It's one way to try to solve a frozen conflict, and that's a discussion for another time. I actually have a book that I'm going to review talking about the Cyprus issue. And it's a way that has, you could say, kept Bosnia in position. I visited the Republika Srpska in the north of Bosnia, and I visited the non-Serbian part of Bosnia as well. And those people really don't like each other, but they have managed to be in a government together. It is problematic. There's lots of complaining on both sides, but there's not murder in the streets. And we might have to look at the fact that there will be a solution that equally displeases both sides. And as we know from real life, when we talk about solutions, we often know that it's a good solution when both people are unhappy in one way or the other, because they've both given up something to get to a solution. Once again, I'm only very remotely a stakeholder here in that as someone who has a particular love for the Holy Land and wants to see the Palestinians treated for the human beings that they are. However, this idea of the West Bank being annexed by Jordan, we've tried that in the past. It didn't work before. And this still leaves the fact that if you do that, what are you going to do with all the settlements in the West Bank? Are we going to dismantle and expel all of the Jews that are in there? Is that politically doable? I'm not saying I would be opposed to that, because it was done in Gaza. All the settlers, there weren't a lot of the settlers, but the settlers were removed, their houses were removed, they were expelled. This could conceivably happen, but the settlements in the West Bank are far more numerous and far more tied to political realities in Israel than the settlements were in Gaza. And Gaza was an easy pullout of the West Bank. You're risking, you can say, the concept of the state of Israel by doing that. It's a high stakes issue. I'm not saying Morris has forgotten more about this issue than I could ever hope to know. So I want to pay respect to that, and I want to pay respect to the fact that I think he is an honest historian, but he has his biases, he has his political views, which are reprehensible in many ways, but that doesn't change the fact that I think he's worth reading and getting over his tics in his writing in which he calls people liars, for example. In any case, if you'd like to read this book, you can find a link to it below, and that's one way that you can support the channel, by buying through the links. You can also leave a super thanks if you enjoyed this discussion. Always helps the channel if you like this. Subscribe, comment, share with people who you know are open-minded and who would like to know more about this issue. If you really like the channel and you want to support it even more, become a patron of my Patreon. That's linked below, or become a member of my YouTube channel. You can also see my Amazon wish list, where you can pick books that you'd like me to review and potentially bump them up. People who are members or belong to my Patreon have the ability to see these videos before they go out to the general public. They also have the opportunity to suggest books ahead of time for me to review. A reminder that portion of the proceeds from all of these different revenue streams will go towards the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, which is a fund that helps Palestinian children get medical care when they otherwise couldn't. As always, enjoy your reading.